Welcome back, folks. I'm Frizz, and today I'd like to take some time to talk about the upcoming Pathfinder Kineticist playtest, or at least what I would personally want to see from it, so that I can brag about what I got right whenever the playtest is actually released in a couple of days. For those of you who don't know, in July of 2023, Paizo is going to be releasing the next big rulebook outside of the Treasure Vault, titled Rage of the Elements, which will contain a bunch of fun elemental stuff in addition to the Kineticist class. Kineticists are basically benders from Avatar: The Last Airbender or Legend of Korra, with a fun dash of Dragon Ball Z, and I really love them. They were a fan favorite class in Pathfinder 1st edition, and with their conversion to Pathfinder 2e, Paizo has a great chance to address the failings of the original Kineticist design and make an amazing class. Keep in mind that everything that I say in this video is all my opinion, so let's get into it. Okay, so let's address one of the biggest questions about the Kineticist, their key ability score. In Pathfinder 1st edition, all of the Kineticist abilities were actually keyed off of their con score, since their limit of their power was how much their body could handle channeling through it. If Kineticists in 2e functioned the same way, then it would be the first class in the entire system that would have Constitution as their key ability score. This would be a pretty big step for 2e's design as a whole, and I'm personally a big fan of the idea. I don't see a reason why there can't be a class that uses con as their key ability score. I love the idea of a class that has an insane amount of power and is only being held back by how much their body can handle. While having Constitution as the key ability score for a class would be very strong, as it's a very good stat for defense, there are tons of ways to balance around that. For example, let's talk about Burn. Burn was a mechanic in Pathfinder 2e where a kineticist could overcharge their abilities at the cost of dealing non-lethal damage to themselves that couldn't be healed. Effectively, if you really want to shoot out that big fire blast, you can, so long as you burn yourself. What made this mechanic interesting is, while you did the unhealable damage to yourself, you also buffed up yourself because you're accumulating a bunch of elemental energy inside of your body, which can make you hit things harder. In my mind, combining a class feature with such a heavy emphasis on risk versus reward, with just having light armor proficiency and only getting 8 hit points a level, could make up for the Kineticist having Constitution as a key ability score. There's a lot of different ways that you can go about it, but hey, I'm just a sucker for risk versus reward mechanics. Although before we actually talk about how that risk versus reward mechanic in 2e might hypothetically work, we first have to talk about, hypothetically, how the rest of the class is going to work mechanically. Or at least how I'd like them to work in the playtest. In my mind, the Kineticist is a martial class that augments their ability to deal damage with additional actions. The predominant way to deal damage is their kinetic blast, which I think should take the form of unarmed attacks similar to the Foxfire Kitsune feat or the Sprite's Spark feat. Basically, you shoot out a blast of elemental energy at someone within around 20 feet. And then, if you want to augment that with other abilities, you can then spend additional actions to add additional effects to your next blast. For example, if you're a pyrokineticist, you could grab an augmentation that makes your kinetic blast deal persistent fire damage on a hit. Now that the basic class concept is out of the way, let's talk about how I'd like a mechanic like Burn to work within that structure. Essentially, I would like for the kineticist to be able to overcharge their bodies to avoid having to spend actions to augment their blast. Do you want to extend the range of your kinetic blast, but you don't have the actions to do it the normal way? Then overcharge yourself and do it in a single action. Now, since avoiding actions is obviously insanely powerful, it has to come with a major downside, and I think there's actually a great example in the Dark Archive. Psychic's Strain Mind feat allows for a Psychic to amp up one of their cantrips without spending a focus spell, by doing a pretty large amount of damage to themselves. Which, to me, makes sense to be a downside for the Kineticist. Imagine that you need to shoot your kinetic blast at someone outside of its normal range, so you take untyped damage equal to your level in order to shoot that blast at them without having to spend actions to augment it the normal way. In case simple damage isn't actually a large enough cost for this ability though, there's also the possibility of applying the Drain condition instead of dealing damage, similar to how the Bones Oracle Mystery works. This would be a lot more permanent and a lot more impactful, and it's just a good way of making sure that people use this ability when they need to use it. Now, moving on, there are actually parts of the 1e Kineticist that I hope are left behind, since it was in no way perfect. The design of classes in 2e should solve a lot of the problems that I have with the first edition Kineticist, as I feel like the biggest problem with the Kineticist in 1E was that Kineticist could easily deal damage while also having good utility abilities. Effectively, a Kineticist could fill many different roles in parties. They could be good at both melee and range damage with little investment. They could also be good scouts, they could be good at knowledges, they could just have all types of utility that other classes just weren't able to compete with, all of the different roles a Kineticist could fill if they wanted to. Now, I do think that this is mostly solved in 2E because it means that with the class feat system, both your utility abilities and your combat abilities are going to be competing for the same class feats. So I don't expect that this is going to be nearly as much of a problem in 2E, but I really hope that they address that. To summarize, I'm hoping for the Kineticist to be a martial class focused on making special strikes called blasts that they can augment with their own special actions. Basically a martial who modifies their strikes with meta magic. It's not meta magic, but it's the same way that spellcasters can modify their own spells with meta magic actions. And if you don't want to spend those special meta magic actions, then you can just overcharge your body to avoid doing it, dealing a fair amount of damage to yourself. The Kineticist has a ton of potential to be a super fun class, and I'm incredibly excited for the playtest this Monday. Thanks for watching. The Kineticist is one of my favorite classes from 1E, so as you might imagine, I'm pretty stoked for this. The next couple of videos are going to be covering the Kineticist, but we'll be getting back to the usually scheduled programming soon enough. I'm really excited about this, okay? I'm actually curious though, what Kineticist abilities from 1E are you looking forward to in particular seeing in 2E? And if you haven't played 1E, then what pops into your mind when you think about this class and the concept for it? Regardless of that though, until I see you next, live a wonderful life.